The city never really cared about people like Marcus Hill. His neighborhood, his skin, his struggles. None of it ever mattered to those who wore the badge. That's why, when he stepped out of his car that night, hands raised, voice calm, he already knew how this would end. The flashing red and blue lights bounced off the cracked pavement, painting his brown skin in violent colors. Officer Darren Cole stood across from him, hand resting on his holster, fingers twitching. He had that look, the one Marcus had seen on cops before, the look that said, "I've already decided who you are." "License and registration," Cole barked. Marcus moved slowly, too slowly, reaching for the glove compartment. "It's in here, officer. I'm just gonna—" "Hands where I can see them." Marcus froze. His heart pounded. He lifted his hands again, palms open, trying to breathe through the sudden wave of panic. He had done nothing wrong. A busted taillight. That's all. But he had seen too many news stories, too many mothers crying on TV, too many names turned into hashtags to believe that innocence mattered. "Step out of the car," Cole ordered. Marcus obeyed. The pavement was still warm from the afternoon sun, but a cold chill ran down his spine. He kept his hands visible, his body still. He could see people watching from the sidewalk, faces half lit by street lamps. No one moved, no one spoke, just another traffic stop in the wrong part of town. "Turn around," Cole commanded. "For what?" Marcus asked, his voice careful, controlled. Cole's lip curled. "I said, turn around." Marcus hesitated. That was the moment everything changed. Cole reached for his gun. No warning, no hesitation, just the click of a safety being flipped off. Marcus never got the chance to speak again. The shot rang out, deafening in the silence. Marcus staggered, confusion in his eyes. He reached for his stomach, his fingertips coming away wet and dark. The world tilted. He stumbled, fell to his knees. He heard screaming, but it sounded distant. A woman, a man, someone shouting, "Why'd you shoot him? He wasn't doing anything." Marcus tried to lift his head, but the pavement was already rising to meet him. The last thing he saw was the cold, empty look in Officer Cole's eyes. Like this was nothing. Like Marcus was nothing. The sirens wailed in the distance, but Marcus already knew they weren't coming to save him. He lay there, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps, as warm blood soaked through his shirt, pooling beneath him. His fingers twitched, reaching for something. Help, hope, anything. But all he found was the rough pavement scraping against his skin. The voices around him blurred together. "He shot him for no reason. Somebody call an ambulance." "Don't move, son. Stay with us." The streetlights above him flickered, their glow hazy. The world was slipping, his body growing heavier with each second. He tried to hold on, tried to stay, but the pain in his stomach was pulling him somewhere else. And then, footsteps, heavy boots, slow, deliberate. Officer Cole stood over him, his gun still drawn, his face unreadable. But Marcus saw it, the slight smirk, the ease in his posture, the way his fingers rested comfortably on the weapon that had just ended a life. "You reached," Cole said flatly, his voice void of any real emotion. "Had to make a call." Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to tell him he was lying, that he had never reached for anything, that his hands had been up. But his mouth wouldn't form the words. His vision blurred as he saw movement, people stepping closer, phones out, recording. A woman pushed past the bystanders, a neighbor, Mrs. Jenkins. She dropped to her knees beside him, tears streaking her wrinkled face. "Hold on, baby," she whispered, pressing shaky hands against his wound. "Help is coming." But Marcus knew better. Help wasn't coming. The police sirens screamed louder, finally arriving, but not for him. Not to save him, they would come to protect their own. Another officer stepped out of a squad car, walking up to Cole. "What happened?" "He reached," Cole said again, his voice as cold as the night air. And just like that, the lie was in motion. Marcus heard the words being repeated, echoed through police radios, whispered between officers. Suspect reached for a weapon. Officer discharged his firearm in self-defense. Tragic situation, but justified response. A script, a well-rehearsed cover-up. Marcus felt his body trembling, his fingers twitching as the rage mixed with the pain. This was how it always happened. They would twist his story before he was even gone. They would dig into his past, find anything, old school fights, minor tickets, friends who had made bad choices. They would turn him into a threat. The last thing Marcus saw before the darkness swallowed him was Mrs. Jenkins sobbing over him, begging him to hold on, her hands shaking as she tried to keep the life from leaving his body. And the last thing he heard? Officer Cole chuckling under his breath as he holstered his gun, like this was nothing. Like Marcus was nothing. The world faded in and out. Marcus could feel himself slipping, his body growing colder despite the heat of the blood soaking through his shirt. Voices swirled around him, some panicked, some calculated. He's still breathing. Where's the ambulance? Back up, give us space. The weight of a knee pressed against his back. He groaned weakly, barely able to react. Hands, rough, unkind, grabbed at his arms, twisting them behind him. He barely had the strength to move, but still, the cuffs snapped around his wrists with cruel tightness. Cuffed while bleeding out. Just in case, one of the cops muttered. Marcus wanted to scream, wanted to fight, but his body wouldn't listen. He was drowning in pain, each breath shallower than the last. And then finally, the sound of an ambulance. Bright white lights flashed as paramedics rushed toward him. They pushed the cops aside, one of them shouting, "What the hell happened?" But the officers didn't answer. He reached, Cole repeated, arms crossed over his chest, voice cool, indifferent. One of the paramedics scoffed, but didn't argue. They had seen this before, too many times. Marcus felt hands pressing on his wound, voices urging him to stay awake. His eyelids fluttered, darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. The pain was unbearable, but even worse was the realization that he might not wake up. Not like this. He fought against the exhaustion, fought to stay in the world that had never really loved him back. Because he wasn't just dying, he was being erased. 2 days later, the city erupted. The video, grainy, shaky, but clear enough, spread like wildfire. A teenager had filmed the whole thing, capturing every second from the moment Marcus raised his hands to the moment Cole pulled the trigger. The clip looped on social media, on news stations, on cell phones across the country. He didn't reach. His hands were up. That cop murdered him. The protests started small. A vigil outside the hospital where Marcus lay in critical condition. Then a march downtown. Then something bigger. Anger rippled through the city. Signs lifted into the air. Justice for Marcus Hill. Stop killer cops. We are tired. Cole was placed on administrative leave. Paid, of course. The police department held a press conference. The chief, a man who had smoothed over countless similar incidents before, stood at the podium and delivered the usual lines. A tragic event? The officer feared for his life. We ask the public not to rush to judgment. Marcus, barely clinging to life, became a battleground. Some called for justice, others defended Cole. News anchors debated whether Marcus had a troubled past. And through it all, Marcus lay in a hospital bed, machines keeping him alive, his fate uncertain. But outside, the city burned with a rage that could no longer be ignored. The hospital room was cold, sterile, filled with the quiet hum of machines, keeping Marcus tethered to life. His body was weak, every breath a battle, but he was still here. Barely. His mother, Denise Hill, hadn't left his side. She sat in the chair next to his bed, gripping his hand like she could hold him in this world by sheer will alone. Her eyes were red, swollen from days of crying, but her face was hard now, etched with a grief that had hardened into something else. Rage. A nurse entered, checking the monitors, but Denise didn't look up. Her focus was on Marcus, on the slow rise and fall of his chest. The bullet had done damage, torn through flesh, shattered a rib, nicked an organ. But he had survived. Against all odds, he had survived. Now she needed to make sure his story did too. Outside, the city was on fire, not from flames, but from fury. Thousands had taken to the streets, demanding justice. The video of Officer Cole pulling the trigger had spread beyond the city, beyond the state. National news stations ran the footage on repeat, The country was watching. But Denise knew how these stories went. They would smear Marcus. They would dig into his past, paint him as a thug, say he had a record, even if he didn't. They would bring up old school fights, say he was no angel. They would call the protests riots. They would say Officer Cole feared for his life. They always did. And if she didn't fight, they would bury her son's truth before he even had the chance to wake up. Denise stood, her back straightening as she let go of Marcus's hand. She had a press conference to attend. The crowd outside City Hall stretched for blocks. Signs lifted into the air. Justice for Marcus. Say his name. End police brutality. Denise stepped onto the podium, flanked by civil rights attorneys, community leaders, and Marcus's closest friends. Microphones pointed at her, cameras flashed, and the world waited. She took a deep breath, then spoke. "My son was shot for no reason," she said, her voice steady, unwavering. "He had his hands up. He did everything he was supposed to do, and Officer Darren Cole shot him anyway." The crowd roared in agreement. Denise looked directly into the cameras, making sure the people watching at home, the ones waiting to twist the story, heard her next words loud and clear. "And now they want to cover it up." She held up her phone. "This is Marcus. This is my baby, not a suspect, not a criminal, a son, a brother, a friend, a man with dreams. And they tried to take him from us." Tears welled in her eyes, but she didn't let them fall. They left him to die in the street, handcuffed him while he bled. And now that the truth is out, they're protecting the man who did it. Well, we won't let them. The crowd erupted again. Denise stepped back as her attorney took over, listing demands, charges against Cole, police accountability, policy changes. But Denise barely heard any of it. She just clenched her fists, looking out at the sea of people chanting her son's name. This fight wasn't over, not by a long shot. Meanwhile, inside a police station miles away, Officer Darren Cole sat in a private office, watching the press conference on his phone. He smirked, shaking his head. "They always do this," he muttered, tossing his phone onto the desk. "They'll protest for a while, then it'll blow over." His lawyer, an older man in a crisp suit, adjusted his tie. "You've been in situations like this before, Darren. Don't worry, the department has your back." Cole leaned back in his chair, unconcerned. He had seen officers before him walk away from worse. The system was built for men like him. He had nothing to worry about, or so he thought, because this time, the people weren't backing down. This time, the fight was just beginning. The protests grew louder, bigger, more relentless. What started as a few hundred angry voices turned into thousands. The city was alive with fury. Marches in the streets, candlelit vigils outside the hospital, chants that echoed through every neighborhood. Justice for Marcus. No justice, no peace. Say his name. News stations had no choice but to cover it. Celebrities tweeted about it. Politicians were forced to acknowledge it. The world was watching. But the police department, they were waiting for the storm to pass, waiting for the public to move on like they always did. Officer Darren Cole sat at home, watching the protests from his couch, sipping beer like it was just another night. He laughed at the news clips, shaking his head as reporters talked about community outrage and calls for justice. "Like I said," he muttered, glancing at his phone, "this'll blow over." But then something changed. A knock at the door. Cole frowned. He wasn't expecting anyone. He set his beer down, wiped his hands on his jeans, and opened the door. Two officers stood on his porch, serious faces, stern expressions. "Darren Cole?" one of them asked. Cole raised an eyebrow. "Yeah?" The cop nodded. "You're under arrest." For the first time since he pulled the trigger, Officer Darren Cole felt something real. Fear. Hours earlier, a grand jury had been presented with the video, the undeniable proof of what happened that night. The footage of Marcus raising his hands, of Cole pulling the trigger without hesitation, of Marcus collapsing to the ground. It wasn't just a tragedy. It was an execution. Public pressure had forced the district attorney's hand. Charges were filed: murder, civil rights violations, misconduct. By the time the news broke, the streets exploded in celebration. But in a hospital bed across town, Marcus Hill still hadn't woken up. His mother stood beside him, clutching his hand, whispering, "Baby, they finally arrested him. They got him." But what good was justice if he never got to see it? The machines beeped. His chest rose and fell. His mother waited. And outside, the fight wasn't over. Because arresting a cop was one thing. Convicting him, that was a whole different battle. The news of Darren Cole's arrest sent shockwaves through the city. People celebrated in the streets, hugging strangers, chanting Marcus's name. The video had forced the system's hand, but no one was naive enough to believe the fight was over. Because they had seen this before. A cop gets arrested, a trial happens. Then, somehow, the jury finds him not guilty, or the charges get dropped, or the defense paints the victim as a threat, twisting the truth until justice slips away. Denise Hill knew this better than anyone. She sat by Marcus's bedside, staring at the pale blue hospital walls, her son's hand still in hers. He hadn't woken up, not once. The doctors said he was stable, that his body was fighting, but the coma had taken hold. And every day that passed, Denise's fear grew. What if he never woke up? What if his name became just another hashtag, a symbol of injustice instead of a man? She squeezed his hand tighter. "Baby, I need you to come back to me," she whispered. "I need you to see this. They got him, they arrested him, but we need you to wake up and tell the world what really happened." A tear slipped down her cheek. The machines beeped steadily beside her, but Marcus didn't move. She wiped her face, took a deep breath, and stood up. If Marcus couldn't speak yet, she would do it for him. The trial date was set. The case had the entire country's attention. News channels ran endless debates, some defending Cole, others demanding a conviction. Prosecutors laid out their case. Marcus had no weapon. His hands were raised. The body cam footage mysteriously malfunctioned, but the cell phone video didn't. And yet, Cole's defense was strong. His lawyer painted him as a good cop in a dangerous situation. They pulled every trick in the book, digging through Marcus's past, twisting his every action. He hesitated, the defense attorney argued. Officer Cole feared for his life. Split-second decisions have to be made in the line of duty. Denise sat in the courtroom, gripping the arms of her chair, rage boiling in her veins. Feared for his life? Marcus had barely moved. He had complied. And still, Cole had shot him like an animal in the street. She could see it in the jury's faces. Some of them were buying it, because that was how the system worked. No matter how clear the evidence, there was always doubt when the victim looked like Marcus. The prosecution fought hard. Activists protested outside the courthouse. The city dared the justice system to do the right thing. And then, after weeks of testimony, arguments, and tense courtroom moments, the jury went into deliberation. The city held its breath. Meanwhile, in the hospital, something changed. A finger twitched, a breath hitched. Then, for the first time since the shooting, Marcus's eyes fluttered open. He was back, and his fight wasn't over. Marcus awoke to a world that had changed while he was gone. His body felt heavy, like it wasn't his own. Pain throbbed deep in his stomach, radiating outward, but it was nothing compared to the confusion swirling in his mind. His eyes struggled to adjust to the bright hospital lights, the beeping machines, the sterile smell of antiseptic. Then he heard a gasp. "Marcus?" His mother's voice, shaky, disbelieving, filled with something between hope and heartbreak. A moment later, warm hands clutched his own. "Baby, can you hear me?" Denise whispered, her fingers gripping his like she was afraid to let go. Marcus tried to speak, but his throat was dry, raw. A weak groan escaped instead. Tears spilled down Denise's cheeks. "You're back," she whispered, pressing a trembling hand to his forehead. "Oh my God, you're back." Marcus's mind fought through the fog. The last thing he remembered was the cold pavement, flashing lights, the weight of blood seeping through his shirt. Then, nothing. "How?" His voice was barely a whisper. "How long?" Denise swallowed hard. "Almost 3 weeks." His stomach twisted, but he wasn't sure if it was from the wound or the weight of that realization. He had lost 3 weeks of his life. He licked his dry lips, eyes flicking toward the machines, the IVs, the hospital gown. "What happened?" Denise took a shaky breath. Baby, you've been in a coma. We almost lost you. She exhaled sharply, like she was forcing herself to stay strong. But you're here, and you need to know. They arrested him. Marcus's heartbeat picked up. Even in his haze, he knew exactly who she meant. Officer Darren Cole. Memories hit him like a train. The cold eyes staring down at him, the sound of the gunshot, the way his body had crumpled before he even realized what happened. Marcus clenched his jaw. They arrested him? Denise nodded, smoothing his curls back like she used to when he was a kid. Yeah, the whole city fought for you. We're fighting for you. Marcus stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. They had arrested him. That was something, but it wasn't enough. Cops like Cole always walked. What about the trial? His voice was stronger now, though still weak. What's happening? Denise hesitated, biting her lip. The jury's deliberating now. Marcus closed his eyes, frustration bubbling in his chest. He had barely survived, and somehow they still had to think about whether the cop who shot him should face consequences. Nothing had changed. He forced himself to sit up, groaning as pain shot through his side. Denise panicked, pressing him back down. Baby, don't... I need to get out of here, Marcus rasped. I need to be there. Denise shook her head. You need to rest. No, Ma. His eyes burned as he looked at her. I need to tell them what happened. I need to tell the world. Because the system had done everything it could to silence him, but he was still here, and he refused to let them erase him. Outside the hospital, the city was at a breaking point. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse, waiting. The jury had been deliberating for 2 days, and tension was suffocating. People held signs, chanted, prayed, hoping for something that history had taught them not to expect. Justice. Inside, Darren Cole sat at the defense table, looking surprisingly relaxed. His lawyer had done everything to frame Marcus as a threat, to cast just enough doubt for the jury to hesitate. But there was one thing they hadn't expected. The courtroom doors opened, and in walked Marcus Hill. The room fell into stunned silence. Even the judge's eyes widened in shock. Cole's smirk faltered. Marcus, still weak, walked slowly, one hand gripping his side, the other clutching the IV stand as his mother helped him forward. But his eyes burned with fire, because he was done being a victim. He was here to speak, and the world would listen. The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder, a ripple of shock spreading through the spectators, the press, even the jury. No one had expected Marcus Hill to walk through those doors. Not after everything he had been through. Not after almost dying. Darren Cole's smug expression was gone now, replaced with something tighter, uncertainty, maybe even fear. His lawyer leaned in, whispering urgently, but Cole barely responded. His eyes were locked on Marcus. Marcus, who was supposed to be gone. Marcus, who refused to stay silent. He walked slowly, every step a reminder of the bullet that had ripped through him. His mother clutched his arm, steadying him, but she didn't try to stop him. She knew better. He wasn't just here for himself. He was here for everyone who had been silenced before him. The judge cleared his throat, shuffling his papers, clearly caught off guard. Mr. Hill, he said, voice measured. I want to testify. Marcus's voice was hoarse but firm. Gasps rippled through the room. Even the prosecutor looked stunned. The judge hesitated. Mr. Hill, we were under the impression that you were still in recovery. I am. Marcus lifted his chin. But I need to speak. He turned his gaze to the jury, eyes dark with fire. Because you're deciding whether the man who almost killed me walks free, and I want you to look me in the eye when you do. The room was silent. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple before nodding. Very well, the court will allow it. The bailiff led Marcus to the witness stand. He sank into the chair, breathing heavily, but his hands were steady as he took the oath. Then he looked directly at the jurors. I remember everything, he said, and he told them. He told them about the flashing lights in his rearview mirror, about the fear that settled in his gut the moment he saw the badge, about how he moved slowly, carefully, trying to do everything right, and how none of it mattered. He already made up his mind about me, Marcus said, his voice unwavering. Before I even spoke, before I even moved. To him, I wasn't a person. I was a threat. Darren Cole shifted in his seat, eyes darting toward the jury. His lawyer scribbled furiously on a notepad. But Marcus wasn't done. He told them about the moment the gun was drawn, the way his stomach clenched with terror, the way time slowed down as he realized. He never hesitated, Marcus said. He never warned me. He just shot. His mother wiped her eyes. The courtroom was dead silent. I was bleeding, dying, and you know what he did? Marcus's voice cracked, but he didn't look away from the jury. He handcuffed me, like I wasn't even human. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay calm. They said he feared for his life. Marcus's eyes burned into Darren Cole. But I was the one bleeding out in the street. A juror, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes, swallowed hard. Another, a younger black man, nodded slightly, jaw tight. Cole's lawyer stood up. "Objection, Your Honor." "Sustained," the judge said. "Mr. Hill, keep your testimony to the events, not your opinions." Marcus took a breath. He had said enough, for now. "I just want you to see me," he said, looking back at the jury. "To remember that I'm not just a name on paper. I'm not just a case." His voice dropped lower. "I'm real, and I almost didn't make it." He leaned forward. "So ask yourself, if I hadn't made it, would you even be thinking about convicting him?" The jury stared at him, and Marcus knew in that moment he had shifted something. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was restless. No one knew how the jury would decide. Would Darren Cole be another cop who walked free, or would this finally be different? Hours passed, then a full day. Then the verdict was in. The city held its breath. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat between his mother and his lawyer, his hands clenched into fists. Across the room, Darren Cole sat stiff, his usual arrogance replaced with something colder. The jury filed in, their faces unreadable. The judge asked the foreman to stand. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" "We have, Your Honor." Silence. "In the case of the state versus Darren Cole, we find the defendant." A pause, and then, "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Denise sobbed into her hands. Marcus exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. People outside screamed, cheered, wept. Darren Cole sat frozen. His face paled, his jaw tightened, but the weight of the word hung over him like a noose. Guilty. For once, the system hadn't let them down. For once, a black man's life had mattered. The sentencing would come later, and the fight for real change was far from over. But that night, as the city celebrated, Marcus sat in his hospital room, looking out the window at the streets below. The same streets where he had almost died. The same streets where people were now chanting his name. He wasn't a hashtag, he wasn't just a story. He was alive, and he wasn't going to let them forget it. Not now, not ever. The end.